My name is Almira Kiabani, and I will be doing my presentation on the impacts of COVID-19 on Alzheimer's disease. During class, we discussed Alzheimer's risk factors, specifically modifiable risk factors, which are those that we can control for or alter. The Lancet Review discussed modifiable risk factors across the life course. In the figure, which you may recognize from lecture, we can see different modifiable risk factors that are prevalent at different stages in one's lifetime. What I'll be focusing on for my presentation today is the risk factor of social isolation during late life. Social isolation is a risk factor that is discussed about across many different reviews and studies. For example, the Landmark study, one that we talked about in lecture, describes that staying socially active is one of 12 actions for a healthier brain at any age. Social isolation and loneliness has been cited in the literature as a risk factor towards Alzheimer's. One study that I found interesting examined the role of late life loneliness as a symptom of Alzheimer's-related molecular pathologies beginning in preclinical Alzheimer's. As we discussed in lecture, the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is the accumulation of amyloid plaques within the brain. In this study, the authors examined the association of cortical amyloid burden with loneliness in a cohort of cognitively normal older adults who are part of a Harvard aging brain study. Loneliness was measured as a self-rated scale, with the interviewers asking questions such as how often do you feel you lack companionship and how often do you feel isolated from others. The authors measured amyloid burden using the Pittsburgh compound B, which is a compound that binds to amyloid in the brain and is visualized using PET scans. What the results found is that higher amyloid burden was significantly associated with self-reported loneliness. In fact, individuals in the amyloid positive group had 7.5 times higher odds of being lonely than those in the amyloid negative group, and that greater loneliness was associated with a doubling of risk of Alzheimer's disease. So from the Lancet study, we saw that depression is another modifiable risk factor of Alzheimer's. One way we can reduce onset of depression or other psychological symptoms could be through social interaction, which could then be thought of as a protective factor. In the Behrens et al. 2016 study, the authors analyzed the effect of social interaction on scores of mood for people with dementia living in long-term care facilities. In the first figure on the slide, I highlighted what the authors defined as methods of social interaction. Some examples are talking and helping others, musical activities of dancing and singing, outdoor activities, and outings with family. The results found that when dementia patients were engaged in any activity, 96% of these observations resulted in self-reported positive mood scores. In fact, the highest mood scores were recorded when these patients were engaged in an outing or shopping activity, musical activities, and outdoor activities related to nature. Other studies that cite social interaction as a protective factor for those with dementia and Alzheimer's has found that participation in social activities was significantly associated with improved cognitive outcomes, as well as older adults with a large social network have a reduced risk of dementia. Therefore, we do have evidence of social interaction as a protective factor against dementia and specifically Alzheimer's. So as we have determined the risk factor of social isolation, we want to understand how COVID-19 and its strict initial lockdown has made its impact on Alzheimer's patients. The restrictions imposed great social implications such that loved ones were unable to visit and interact with Alzheimer's patients, and that there became a massive lack of community support networks for both patients and carers. For example, the methods of social interaction that was described in the last slide, such as musical activities and outings with family, basically became obsolete. There are also clinical implications as well, such that there is an increased prevalence of risk factors for AD due to heavy restrictions. One study found that social isolation led to an exacerbation of neuropsychiatric symptoms in cognitively healthy older adults, as well as those with dementia. Other impacts include the shortage of nurses within care facilities and outbreaks that occur within these facilities. These are obvious increased stressful risk factors that negatively impact those with dementia. So in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Alzheimer's Society released a report on the impact of COVID on people affected by dementia. Some important key points highlighted from this report is listed in the executive summary section. So for example, people with dementia that live alone are more likely to report an increase in their symptoms during lockdown, and 46% of dementia patients state that the pandemic has had a negative impact on their mental health. In fact, over 1 in 3 report having lost confidence in going out and carrying out daily tasks. A key finding is also that those with dementia who live alone report their experience of the pandemic most negatively, with 56% stating that they feel lonelier compared to 23% of those who live with others. And something I found really intriguing is that 41% of those who received a care and support package report this being reduced or stopped since lockdown began. So this is from the same report from the Alzheimer's Society, which shows which symptoms have been exacerbated in people living with dementia during the COVID-19 lockdown. Patients were asked the question of, since lockdown began, have you noticed an increase in any of the following symptoms of dementia in yourself? The results found that the symptom in the cognitive domain were increased the most, with difficulty concentrating and memory loss being the highest. This is followed by an increase in emotional symptoms such as agitation or restlessness, and apathy or a sense of giving up. Furthermore, only 20% report seeing no difference in dementia since lockdown began. Confusion is another important symptom that should be highlighted, which I believe that the lockdown has really exacerbated. For example, one patient states, "I find it quite difficult to even know what the day is. Normally I know what I do any day of the week with friends and people with Alzheimer's groups, and not having all of that makes it very difficult to understand or remember." So another study that examined the effects of social restrictions due to COVID on dementia patients is the Solitude Study, which is short for Social Limitations Turn Up Dementia. This was a multi-center, observational longitudinal study that documented changes in cognitive performance, mental health, and quality of life of people with dementia. The restrictions started in March 2020, and the study started in September 2020, which is 6 months after restrictions were implemented. The researchers gave telephone assessments to measure a patient's cognitive abilities, such as the mini mental state exam. And so results found that the time spent under social restrictions after 6 months was negatively associated with cognitive performance for persons with dementia, and this was particularly detectable on tests of episodic and semantic memory. However, patients became cognitively and behaviorally stable over the next 6-month timeline of the study, despite adherence to rules imposing restrictions to social contacts. The authors postulate that this period of observation in the study occurred at a time where people may have developed a degree of adjustment to the situation, and that these patients may have adapted to cope with the consequences of enforced social limitations. So, to follow up with that, as many of us know, we have adopted strategies to still connect ourselves to our loved ones and friends, and so resources for those living with dementia and Alzheimer's were also implemented to mitigate social isolation. So studies found that virtual face-to-face interaction was superior to non-visual modes of communication. For example, using video interfaces allows people with dementia to grasp nonverbal cues and mitigate confusion with whom they may be speaking to. We saw an example of this in the Still Alice novel, such that Alice reported that without the aid of visual cues, conversations on the phone really baffled her. There are also ways of implementing treatment virtually, such as remote delivered cognitive behavioral therapy and tele-behavioral activation. So tele-BA is essentially a virtual version of behavioral activation to engage patients in social activities, thereby decreasing symptoms of depression and isolation. It was found to result in significantly greater improvements in facets of social connectedness for those with dementia. And so I wanted to lastly include a depiction of a patient with Alzheimer's and her personal experience of how COVID-19 had impacted her. So Joyce Thompson is a woman that is diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and had moved into an assisted living retirement home. She was enrolled in the Alzheimer's Society's day program 6 days a week, which is a program that provided social and cognitive stimulation to people living with dementia. Patients were able to connect with others and participate in programming such as music, dance, and art, thus fostering a high sense of social community. Joyce was described as someone who loved to help others and loved when staff gave her a job or to look after something. Then, when COVID-19 hit, the day programs became shut down, and residents often had to stay within their own rooms and unable to participate in activities. During outbreaks, patients could not even go to the dining room for meals. Joyce's daughter recounts how her mother went from seeing and being with people every day to only seeing the person who delivered her meals and medications wearing full PPE that would result in high amounts of confusion and stress. Joyce's daughter reports that her mother went through an exacerbation of cognitive decline. So this is just one example of a personal account of how COVID has disrupted the lives of those with Alzheimer's. So in summary, we have evidence that social isolation is indeed an important risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and we've seen numerous studies as to how it relates to cognitive decline for people with Alzheimer's. Of course, the biggest question we should ask ourselves when understanding the literature is whether we can attribute the acceleration of decline for AD patients solely with COVID, or whether it's a normal progression of decline, as many of the consequences we've seen, such as memory loss and depression, are hallmark symptoms of Alzheimer's. But based on my knowledge from class and what I've read in the literature, Alzheimer's disease progression is multifaceted, and social isolation is a significant contributing risk factor. For future work on this topic, I hope to see sequential longitudinal studies in this regard, if possible, and to understand long-term impacts a few years after COVID has hit. It would also be interesting to see whether there has been implementation of new proactive strategies for anticipation of future lockdowns, as simply shutting everything down proved to be harmful in many aspects. And so these are my references in case you were interested in following up on the studies that I've read. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you so much for listening.